Immersed Robot.
Hello everyone, welcome to Immersed Robot, and this time I wanted to take a look at the game Boneworks just to see how it performs on an RTX 3080. My full system specs are in the description to this video just so you can check them out, but I'm also running 32GB of RAM and a Ryzen 5 5600X just for your reference as well with regards to this, because the CPU does play an important role in this test as well. It's something to keep in mind. But I started out in this little area and I ramped all the settings right up to their maximum, while also starting with a baseline of 90Hz in the Valve Index at 100% Steam VR super sampling. The Steam VR super sampling does make a difference in this game. You can change it on the fly as well if you want to do that, so you can obviously change those settings. I do change the resolution a little bit later on in this test, just for your reference, just so you can see how it performs. So for the most part on this first little small section at 90 frames per second, we're maintaining it pretty solidly. It runs fine. The thing with this game, I think it's safe to say that basically a lot of the settings that I try in this game run fine for the most part. The difference is that there are definite like small sections, small hitches here and there whenever you enter a new area, or specific parts of the game where you'll notice a sudden drop in frame rate. Now, I don't notice it too much in the headset in all honesty, it's just like a small hitch here and there, but with the FPS VR overlay right in front of you, you can see this far more clearly, of course. But I'll come on to a little point where I can sort of get quite a consistent drop in frame rate when I go outside into the wider area in a moment. But for the most part in this first little section, you'll see that the GPU, you'll get sudden little spikes depending on what you're doing, and it will drop into reprojection, will drop down to those 45 frames per second rather than maintaining the consistent 90. But it runs okay for like large portions of the time. It's only occasionally that you'll get those drops. Okay, so still running at the absolute max in-game settings with regards to this. Just in this outside area, you'll see that whenever I look at this central part of this area, the frame rate will drop. And this is consistent for all the tests going forward throughout this video. You'll notice that there will be dropped frames whenever you look at that central pillar in the central area of this large outdoors section. Again, most of the time it's running fine at 90 FPS, still running at that 100% Steam VR super sampling as well, so it runs okay for the most part. I really didn't have too many complaints, but when you're looking at the frame rate and analysing it on this level, you'll see that there are certainly drops in this section as well. So I went back into the in-game graphical settings and dropped multi-sampling anti-aliasing down to 4 times rather than the maximum 8 times. And you'll notice that there's quite a stark difference in terms of performance here. The GPU is not working anywhere close to as much as it was before. Looking at that central area, you'll see that the frame rate does drop momentarily before going back up to that 90 and maintaining it pretty consistently once again. So at this point I decided to try a higher refresh rate in the Valve Index headset and upped it to 120Hz, and again we're running at relatively solid 120 frames per second with those same settings, so the 4 times multi-sampling anti-aliasing, everything else on max. Again, you'll see when I look at this central part in this outdoor area, it drops once again. So it's just that little section really that you'll notice, and it's sort of, you can extrapolate that out to other areas of the game as well. I noticed when playing through the tutorial section, changing these settings as well, I noticed that there were just various small areas where it would suddenly drop in frame rate before getting back up to that more consistent locked native frame rate to the headset. And again, you can see I'm running for the most part 120 frames per second pretty solidly here on these settings, which is great. So next I decided to push things a little bit further and I went up to the 144Hz, and yeah, this wasn't really maintaining too well in most areas. I basically used this outdoor section, this first wide open section of the game, to run these tests because it seemed like the best area where it was pushing things a little bit more than usual. I'm sure there are sections which are far more demanding than this later on in the game. I've not played through the entire game so I can't speak to that. But yeah, it was struggling with this 144 frames per second native at these settings. I briefly dropped things down to 80 FPS and as expected really it was running perfectly fine with this. Again, there were small drops though, even at this lower refresh rate in the index there were still dropping frames here and there, but not too often. It was far more stable, far more solid, and still okay to play. I'm one for those high refresh rates in certain games, and this is one I felt like it did make a difference for some reason. I'm not too sure why, but yeah, 80 frames per second was pretty solid overall. Yeah, I mean there's no complaints here apart from the very minor hitch here and there. Then 80 frames per second is no problem on these settings. So I went back up to 90 Hz in the Valve Index headset. Again, 90 frames per second was running stable. I changed the SteamVR super sampling up to 150% just to get a little bit sharper detail within the headset. And yeah, again, it was the same issue really. Most of the time it was running pretty solid at 90 FPS, but there definitely were still the same old areas that were creating problems and creating small dips and hitches in the game. Not too much to worry about really, in all honesty, with regards to that. It didn't affect too much, and I'm not sure I would have noticed them because they're so minor, they're over so quick that you don't notice them too much. You will if you look out for them, I can say that, but they didn't bother me too much. And for the most part, looking at these frame rates, it's running okay here. So I decided to, still maintaining all these same old settings, I went up to 200% SteamVR super sampling this time, and obviously it gave a much sharper image in the headset, but of course it was probably dropping more than it was in the previous 150%. All makes sense, you know, no surprises here really with regards to that, but you could still maintain 90 in large areas of the game. You know, it wasn't a huge issue, but of course you are pushing things really to the very limit when you go to something like 200% SteamVR super sampling. I dropped multi-sampling anti-aliasing down to 2 times and it affected things again. You know, multi-sampling anti-aliasing does make a big difference in this game in terms of performance and what you can do. Obviously you'll get best performance if you turn multi-sampling anti-aliasing off, but a lot of people don't like that. They don't like the jaggies on the distant objects and things like that you will inevitably get if you turn off that entirely. But it does make a big difference to performance in this particular game, as does of course super sampling will make a equal impact on performance. So keeping things at those slightly lower settings, everything else on maximum in-game other than multi-sampling anti-aliasing, I ramped things back up to 120Hz in the Valve Index, and again this was running great now. You can still see that there are those areas. Again, you look at that central section in this outdoor area and things will drop again. Unavoidable really, I'm not too sure what's going on with that. But for the most part, once again, 120 FPS, pretty solid in this section. So here I decided to drop multi-sampling anti-aliasing down to 0, so I turned it off completely just to see the effect of that, and you can see, you know, you do get a more solid 120 frames per second briefly before I switch over to 144Hz in the Valve Index. I wanted to test this again, and this was running now at a much more consistent rate. Again, that central section causes problems, but for the most part you can run at 144Hz at 200% SteamVR super sampling in large areas of this game. You'll see sections like this. This will be a problem, of course, with this type of game where you'll get fluctuations in performance depending on the individual area you're in. So it's not ideal, but you can see here that it's running pretty well at that 144 frames per second native. Again, that 200% SteamVR super sampling is probably a little bit more than I would go to. 150 would give you a slightly better performance and more consistent performance. You still won't remove those sections where it just drops in frame rate suddenly anyway. I don't think there's anything you can do about that other than really lowering settings right the way down. So to finish off here, I just went back to 120Hz in the index and then changed multi-sampling anti-aliasing back up to those 2x, and that was a nice way to play it. Again, this, as I previously said, 120 frames per second is a great way to play this game, I find. Once again, I didn't change that SteamVR super sampling, but going back in I probably would do that back down to 150. But yeah, it runs relatively well, but there are still these inconsistencies which, when you're looking at the FPS VR overlay while you're playing, it's a little bit frustrating, honestly, to see those dropped sections. But if that wasn't there, I don't think it would impact the overall experience of the game in too much of a jarring way. So it's a great game to play. It's not particularly, there's certain frustrations I have with the game in general anyway, but in terms of performance, it runs pretty well, barring those small caveats that I've mentioned throughout this video. But that's pretty much it. Thank you for watching this quick test on Boneworks, and as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, my full PC specs are in the description below. You can check those out so you can get more of a context of the kind of PC I'm running this on, just to get these results. But that's pretty much it. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.
Please hesitantly tap the like button, and don't forget to subscribe for more concise and informative VR content. You can also join our Discord by clicking on the link in the description of this video. And, as always, I'll catch you on the flippity flip.